I'm Edward, and it's always a pleasure to spend this quiet time with you. Share with us where you're listening from and what is your favourite book. Be sure to subscribe so you can return for a new mystery every day. Now, let the story unfold. Chapter 1. The Remark. No one applauded. The village of Thornwick Parva had not changed appreciably in 30 years, which was, in the opinion of most of its residents, entirely as it should be. Its lanes remained narrow and shaded, its cottage gardens reliably untidy in the most pleasing fashion, and its social occasions conducted with the particular blend of warmth and watchfulness that distinguishes a small English village from anywhere else in the world. The hawthorn was in blossom that late May evening, and its faint sweetness drifted through the open casement windows of Mrs. Eleanor Finch's sitting room as the members of the Thornwick Parva reading circle settled themselves into their customary places. The room itself was as familiar to its regular visitors as their own parlours, perhaps more so, for Mrs. Finch maintained it with a devotion approaching ceremony. The bookshelves along the far wall were arranged not alphabetically, nor by subject, but by a system known only to their hostess, which meant that Trollope stood companionably beside a volume on beekeeping, and a biography of Admiral Nelson leaned against 3 novels of the lighter sort. Floral cushions and faded chintz softened the armchairs, and the low table before the fireplace bore, as always, a china teapot of considerable age and a plate of shortbread that no one ever quite finished. Mrs. Eleanor Finch herself stood near the mantelpiece as her guests arrived, in greeting each with a composed graciousness that had long established her as the natural centre of Thornwick's modest social life. She was a woman of perhaps 65, handsome rather than pretty, with grey hair arranged in careful waves, and the manner of someone accustomed to being depended upon. Her late husband had been a solicitor of modest standing, and she had retained from that association an air of measured reliability, as though she had spent decades ensuring that all things were properly documented and all matters conducted in good order. She was not cold, her eyes were kind enough, but she managed sentiment as she managed her bookshelves, with a system and without fuss. Beside the window, adjusting his jacket with the small but definite movements of a man who considers his appearance a matter of civic importance, stood Mr. Leonard Harwood. He had been chairman of the reading circle for 11 of its 14 years, a tenure that had concluded 18 months prior when he relinquished the position ostensibly on grounds of increasing parish commitments, though several members privately considered that Eleanor Finch had simply grown tired of asking him to keep the evening's discussion to a reasonable length. He was a tall man, somewhat spare, with a high forehead and the habit of pressing his lips together before speaking, as though each sentence required a moment of internal approval before being released into the world. He had taught school for many years before retiring, and he retained a schoolmaster's instinct for the sound of his own voice, which he found not unpleasant. Miss Laura Pritchard, the club's secretary, was already seated in the chair nearest the lamp, her attendance notebook open on her knee, and her pen uncapped with the purposeful air of someone determined to be useful. Laura was perhaps 40, slight and conscientious, with the kind of face that is more agreeable in expression than in repose. She had kept the club's records for 6 years without error or complaint, and if her handwriting was not beautiful, it was at least legible, which is, as anyone who has tried to read committee minutes will attest, the more important virtue. Several other members completed the circle that evening, Mr. and Mrs. Poulton from the old farmhouse at the edge of the village, the retired schoolmistress Miss Denholm, who brought her own biscuits and seldom commented on the book but asked excellent questions, and young Mr. Evansford, who had moved to Thornwick the previous autumn and been invited to join on the strength of having once reviewed poetry for a county periodical. And then there was Mrs. Margaret Blythe. She had arrived, as was her custom, a few minutes after everyone else. Not from discourtesy, but from the particular pleasure she took in entering a room that was already occupied. She was a vigorous woman of 70, with a rounded figure and a directness of manner that some found refreshing, and others found alarming, depending largely on how recently she had directed it at them. She had lived in Thornwick Parva for 40 years, outlived one husband and several firmly held opinions, and participated in the reading circle since its earliest days. She read widely and argued cheerfully, and could be relied upon to say the thing that others were carefully not saying, which made her both invaluable and occasionally inconvenient. Seated a little apart from the main circle, in the chair nearest the door, was Miss Jane Marple. She was a slender elderly lady of quiet appearance, dressed in grey wool of a sensible weight for the season, with white hair worn simply and eyes of a particularly clear and attentive blue. She had come to Thornwick Parva some months before to stay with a distant relation, and had been introduced to the reading circle by Mrs. Finch, who believed firmly that visitors should be included in village life before they had the opportunity to feel excluded from it. Miss Marple attended the evenings with evident pleasure and said comparatively little, which several members found restful. She knitted during the discussions, something in pale yellow that had not yet revealed itself to be any particular object, and listened with the quality of attention that belongs to someone who finds other people genuinely, inexhaustibly interesting. The evening's novel was one of the detective variety, a well-regarded title in which a wealthy man dies under circumstances eventually shown to be considerably less natural than first supposed. The murderer, it transpired, then had been sitting quietly in plain view throughout, relying on the collective disinclination of polite society to think the worst of an agreeable face. The discussion had proceeded for perhaps 40 minutes in its usual pleasant fashion. Questions of motive, observations on character, a brief digression from Mr. Harwood concerning the conventions of the form, when Mrs. Blythe, who had been listening with a small smile, set down her teacup and said, "It is rather convincing, isn't it? The way no one sees what is in front of them." "The author manages it quite naturally," said Miss Denholm. "Oh, I don't only mean in the novel," said Margaret Blythe pleasantly. "We all know someone, I think, who once escaped justice rather handily." She spoke with the lightness of one offering a general observation about the weather. The secret is simply not to look guilty at the critical moment. There was laughter of the mild and sociable sort. And the conversation might have turned back to the novel without further incident had Mrs. Blythe not added, in a tone that was somehow both softer and more distinct, "Perhaps even here." The laughter did not continue. It was not precisely that the room fell silent. People shifted in their chairs, and Mr. Evansford refreshed his teacup, and Miss Denholm straightened the biscuit plate. But there was a quality of altered attention, the kind that settles over a gathering when something has been said that cannot quite be unsaid. Most of those present allowed themselves a brief, incredulous smile, as one does when a remark is clearly too absurd to require acknowledgement. Most, but not all. Miss Marple, who had not ceased her knitting, observed from her chair by the door that two faces among the company had undergone a brief but unmistakable change of expression. It lasted only a moment, a sudden stillness, and quickly recovered, replaced with the same polite amusement worn by everyone else. But the change had been there, and Miss Marple had seen it, and she thought it interesting. Mrs. Blythe said nothing further on the subject. She accepted more shortbread, agreed with Miss Denholm's assessment of the novel's ending, and departed at 9:30 in excellent spirits. 3 days later, on a Tuesday morning of quiet sunshine, Margaret Blythe was found by her daily help, Mrs. Roper, in her armchair by the sitting-room window. She had the appearance of someone who had simply ceased, between one breath and the next, without distress or struggle. Dr. Halford, who attended promptly and examined her with thoroughness, noted the long-standing condition of her heart and signed the certificate with the equanimity of a man who has seen the same sad conclusion many times. The village received the news with a mixture of sorrow and acceptance that attends the death of the elderly. Miss Marple, walking home past the hawthorn hedge, found that her thoughts returned with quiet persistence to a sitting-room, a remark that had not quite been laughed away, and two faces that had, for just a moment, become very still indeed. Chapter 2. An empty teacup by the fireplace. The news of Margaret Blythe's death moved through Ashmere Green in the manner that all such news moves through a small village, quietly at first, in the careful exchanges of the post office and the greengrocer's, and then with rather more energy once it had been confirmed by Dr. Henley himself, who was seen leaving Ivy Cottage on Friday morning with his bag under his arm and his expression set in the professionally composed lines of a man who has nothing unexpected to report. By Saturday it was settled fact. By Sunday it had acquired the particular solemnity that attaches to the death of a long-established resident, a solemnity tempered, as such things always are in villages, by the comforting understanding that Margaret had lived a full life and that her heart had, in the end, simply done what weak hearts do. Miss Marple attended the small service at St. Bridget's the following Thursday, sitting in the third pew from the rear as was her habit, and observing with the discreet attention of someone who has attended enough such occasions to know that they reveal rather more about the living than about the departed. Leonard Harwood sat in the front pew, which was perhaps slightly forward of his intimacy with Margaret, though he had been known to serve alongside her on the parish hall committee some years previously. He bowed his head at the appropriate moments and sang the hymns in a careful baritone. Eleanor Finch sat one row behind him, straight-backed and composed, her dark coat pressed and her expression one of dignified sorrow. Laura Pritchard sat further back, beside Dorothy Spenlow, who had brought a handkerchief and made considerable use of it. Agnes Spenlow, Miss Marple noticed, did not sing. She stood with the others and held the order of service in both hands and looked, not at the rector, but at the small stained-glass window above the chancel, the one depicting St. Bridget herself in shades of amber and green, with the fixed, inward gaze of someone who is thinking very carefully about something quite unrelated to the proceedings immediately before them. Miss Marple found this worth noting, and filed it away in the orderly but capacious cabinet of her mind alongside several other small observations, where it waited patiently to be useful. The book club met the following Tuesday, at Mrs. Finch's insistence. There had been some gentle debate among the members about whether it was quite proper to resume so soon, but Eleanor had argued with the measured firmness that was characteristic of her, that Margaret herself would have been the first to deprecate any excessive interruption to the ordinary business of the club, and this was generally felt to be true. Margaret had been, if anything, rather impatient with what she called the English tendency to make grief an administrative matter, and so they came. Leonard and Laura with her notebook, and Dorothy, and Agnes, and Miss Marple, who arrived at her customary moment and settled into her customary chair beside the window, where the late afternoon light came through in a long, soft bar across the carpet. The room was precisely as it had always been. The floral cushions, the orderly shelves, the low table with its plate of biscuits, the pot of Earl Grey beneath its woolen cosy, and yet the chair, Margaret's chair, the one with the slightly higher armrest that she had always preferred and which Eleanor had never had any cause to rearrange, stood empty beside the fireplace, and on the small table to its right sat a teacup. It was a clean cup brought out as habit and placed there before Eleanor had thought quite what she was doing. She saw it herself as the others settled, and a faint colour came into her face, and she moved to take it away. "Leave it, if you please," said Miss Marple pleasantly, and something in her tone, quite mild, entirely undemanding, caused Eleanor to pause and set the cup back down and say nothing further on the subject. The meeting began. They had agreed to postpone any further discussion of the previous month's novel, and to spend the evening instead in the gentle, unstructured reminiscence that communities turn to when one of their number has gone. This suited Miss Marple perfectly well. She listened rather more than she spoke, which was her custom in any case, and what she heard was instructive. Dorothy remembered Margaret most vividly for her strong opinions on the subject of biography versus fiction, and on the particular iniquity of abridged editions. She had apparently once written a firmly worded letter to a publisher on this subject, and Dorothy found this enormously admirable. Laura said that Margaret had been unfailingly kind about the quality of the minutes, which she well knew had sometimes been hurried, and had never once made Laura feel inadequate in the role. She said this quietly and without ornamentation, and meant it. Agnes said that Margaret had made the best Victoria sponge she had ever tasted, and that she'd never been able to produce anything remotely comparable herself, though she had twice attempted to follow the same recipe. Leonard said that Margaret had been a considerable asset to the club and to the village at large, and that she would be greatly missed. He said it with the precise degree of warmth required by the occasion, no more, no less, and returned his gaze to the middle distance with an expression of composed reflection. Miss Marple watched him while he spoke, and thought about several things. She thought about the quality of a silence, and how it differs from the quality of a performance. She thought about the distinction between a man who is grieving and a man who is demonstrating to the satisfaction of those present that he is the sort of man who would grieve. She thought, too, about Margaret's remark, that small, unhurried grenade released into the comfortable sitting room of the book club just 3 weeks previous, and about the deliberate swiftness with which Leonard had redirected the conversation on that particular evening. He had done it well, she would grant him that. After a time, the conversation drifted, as it will, into the more comfortable territory of mild anecdote and shared memory. And the particular tension that had been present at the start of the evening began to ease. Dorothy had a story about Margaret and the parish fete of some years ago. Eleanor contributed a memory of a reading group trip to a literary lecture in the county town, during which Margaret had engaged the speaker in a lengthy exchange from which the speaker had not entirely emerged with his dignity intact. Miss Marple smiled at this, for she remembered it clearly. She was never theatrical, she said, when the laughter had settled. Margaret, one always felt that when she said something, she had thought about it quite carefully first. That is a very apt description, Eleanor agreed. I was thinking, Miss Marple continued in the reflective, trailing manner she often employed when she was thinking nothing of the sort, of her remarks the last time we met, the conversation we were having about the novel. She contributed several very interesting observations. The room did not precisely still, but it changed, in the way that rooms change when something has been introduced that everyone was either hoping would not be mentioned, or hoping very much would be. She did say one or two things, Dorothy offered carefully. She was always one for a provocative thought, Leonard said, with a short, decided nod that served as punctuation, the end of the sentence, and he clearly felt of the topic. Miss Marple looked at the empty chair and at the teacup beside it, catching the last of the late afternoon light. Yes, she said mildly. I thought so too. She did not elaborate. She reached for her own cup, found it pleasantly warm, and allowed the conversation to move on around her, carrying with it whatever relief those present may have wished to feel. What was avoided, she had always found, deserved the most careful attention of all. Chapter 3. A passage. Chosen. Too carefully. There is a particular kind of memory that asserts itself not at the moment of an event, but some days afterward, when the mind has had sufficient time to set aside whatever it was doing and turn the matter over quietly, the way one might turn over a stone in the garden to examine what lies beneath. Miss Marple had been doing a good deal of this in the week following the Tuesday meeting. She went about her ordinary affairs, a conversation with her gardener, Bert, regarding the state of the sweet peas, a visit to Mrs. Trent at the post office for stamps, and a mild exchange of opinion on the subject of the new pillar box, which had been repositioned 3 feet further from the corner than strictly convenient. A Wednesday afternoon spent turning the heel of a stocking by the sitting-room window, while the village went quietly about its business beyond the glass. All of this occupied the foreground of her days in a perfectly satisfactory manner, but in the background, with the patient persistence of a piece of music one cannot quite place, certain details continued to present themselves for examination. Chief among them was a memory she had not thought very much about at the time, because at the time it had seemed no more than a small characteristic flourish of Margaret Blythe's, the kind of thing one registers and sets aside without analysis. Now, turning it over in the unhurried manner she had long cultivated, it seemed rather less incidental than she had supposed. It concerned the reading aloud. The book club had a custom, established in its earlier years and continued more from affectionate habit than any particular conviction of its educational merit, of reading certain passages aloud before discussion. The selection of these passages rotated among the members, and on the evening in question it had been Margaret's turn. Margaret had prepared, as she generally did, with quiet thoroughness. She'd marked a chosen passage with a slip of paper, a length of cream ribbon, actually, retrieved from some domestic purpose, and pressed into service as a bookmark. And when Eleanor indicated that it was time, she had opened the novel without hesitation, and found her place with the ease of someone who has visited it more than once in recent days. The passage she had selected described, "Ye in the novel's measured and rather elegant prose, the moment at which the investigating character begins to understand how a death certified as natural had in fact been assisted. The device employed in the story was not a substance, but a circumstance. The deliberate removal of a particular comfort, a medication, a habitual relief, so that the body was left to fail not by any dramatic intervention, but by the simple, deniable withdrawal of what had been sustaining it. The passage was not the most dramatically compelling in the novel. It was not the confrontation scene, nor the revelation, nor even the carefully constructed exchange in which the detective first voices the possibility of wrongdoing. It was rather a passage of retrospective analysis, the detective sitting with what he has learned and turning it over very carefully, the way a craftsman examines a piece of work for the precise point at which something went wrong. An unusual choice, then, for a reading. Not the most obvious passage, nor the most entertaining, nor the one that was likely to provoke the liveliest discussion. Margaret had lingered over certain phrases with a particularity that Miss Marple had registered at the time, as perhaps slightly more than ordinary enthusiasm. She had read the phrase, "The absence of intervention can be as deliberate as the intervention itself," twice, once at its proper pace, and then again, after a small pause. With the quiet deliberateness of someone who wishes to ensure a thing has been heard, Miss Marple found her opportunity on Thursday morning, when Dorothy Spenlow came to return a small cake tin she had borrowed the previous month, and stayed, as she reliably did, for a cup of tea and a considerable quantity of conversation. Dorothy was not, as a rule, a source of the most focused intelligence. She knew a great deal about a great many things, and offered it all with equal enthusiasm, which made the process of extraction rather like fishing in a well-stocked but enthusiastically turbulent stream. Nevertheless, she had a genuine fondness for Margaret, and a memory that, once directed to a specific object, was surprisingly reliable. "I was thinking about the last meeting," Miss Marple said, with the air of someone returning to a pleasantly unresolved train of thought. "The reading Margaret did. I have been trying to remember the passage she chose." "Oh, yes," said Dorothy, and setting down her cup with the alertness of someone who finds the subject agreeable. "The one about the doctor, wasn't it? Or rather, the lack of one. Very well done, I thought, though Agnes said afterward that she found it rather sad." She read one phrase twice, I thought. Dorothy considered this with the serious attention she brought to all questions of detail. She did. I noticed that as well. I assumed she had simply lost her place for a moment. Margaret's eyesight, Leia's had not been entirely reliable for the past year. "Yes," said Miss Marple, "that had occurred to me as well." She said this in the tone of someone who has considered an explanation and found it adequate, and Dorothy accepted the mild agreement and moved on to the matter of the new pillar box, about which she also had views. But Miss Marple had not in fact found the explanation adequate. She had observed Margaret at those meetings for more than 15 years, and she had never, in that time, seen her lose her place in a text. She had seen her pause for emphasis. She had seen her look up to make certain of her audience before delivering a line she considered important. She had never seen her repeat herself by accident. Margaret had chosen that passage with intention, and she had read that particular phrase twice with intention. The question was the nature of the intention, and for whom, precisely, the repetition had been meant. That afternoon, Miss Marple walked to the small lending library at the far end of the High Street, where Mr. Pomfrey presided with the gentle authority of a man who has spent 40 years in the company of books, and found them, on the whole, more reliably satisfying than people. She requested the novel in question, and spent a pleasant half-hour in the window seat reserved for readers, turning its pages with the careful attention of someone who is not, this time, reading for pleasure. The passage Margaret had selected occupied just under 2 pages in the middle of the book's 7th chapter. Reading it again in the library's dusty afternoon quiet, Miss Marple found that it held rather more weight than she had given it at the time. The central argument of the passage, rendered in the detective's dry and precise interior voice, was that the withdrawal of care is not a neutral act when care is known to be necessary. That a person aware of another's fragility, who then introduces distress or alarm into that person's circumstances, cannot reasonably claim innocence of consequence. The detective in the novel stopped short of calling it murder in any legal sense. But he was quite clear that it was not nothing. Miss Marple closed the book and sat for a moment with it in her lap, looking out at the high street where Mrs. Atwell was inspecting the fruit outside the greengrocer's, with the expression of someone who expects to be disappointed and rarely is. She thought about Margaret sitting in the book club, reading this passage aloud to people who had known one another for years, who had attended the same literary evenings and served on the same committees and drunk tea in the same sitting room through a long succession of winters and springs. She thought about the way Leonard Harwood had set down his cup. She thought about Eleanor looking at the fire. There was nothing she could take to anyone. There was no evidence, no witnessed exchange, or no document of any kind. There was only a woman who had been somewhat deliberate with her reading, and who was now gone, and a room full of carefully composed faces. But Miss Marple had begun, in the quiet and methodical way that was entirely natural to her, to construct a picture. It was incomplete as yet, more suggestion than image, more pencil sketch than finished work. But certain lines were beginning to resolve themselves with a clarity she had learned, over many years, to take seriously. As she returned the novel to Mr. Pumphrey with a word of thanks, walked home along the lane in the mild afternoon, and permitted herself the small private observation that Margaret Blythe had been, in the end, a rather more deliberate woman than most people had given her credit for. Shall I continue to Chapter 4, The Secretary's Uneven Hand? Chapter 4, The Secretary's Uneven Hand. It had been Miss Marple's experience, accumulated over a great many years of quiet observation, that the most revealing documents are rarely the ones people think to conceal. The letters locked in drawers, the diaries hidden behind picture frames, these are the products of deliberate anxiety, and anxiety, however justified, has a tendency to over-prepare. What betrays people, in the end, is nearly always something they did not think worth hiding. A receipted bill left in a coat pocket, a note dashed off in haste and tucked into the back of a household ledger, the margin of a borrowed book bearing a name written in an idle moment and then forgotten. Or, as the present case suggested, a secretary's notebook in which the handwriting had changed. The opportunity arose, as Miss Marple's opportunities so often did, without any very deliberate engineering on her part. She was a firm believer in the principle that if one moves about one's village in the ordinary way, attentive and unhurried, occasions for useful conversation will present themselves with reasonable regularity. This was not, she would have been the first to acknowledge, a universally applicable method. It required a particular sort of village, and a particular sort of patience, and a willingness to drink rather more tea than was perhaps strictly medicinal. But Ashmere Green suited the method admirably. It was Agnes Spenlow who provided the occasion, quite without intending to. Miss Marple encountered her on Friday afternoon at the corner of the High Street, where Agnes was standing with a library book under one arm and an expression of mild uncertainty on her face, looking in the direction of the lending library as though she had forgotten whether she was going toward it or returning from it. Miss Marple offered a word of greeting, and Agnes received it with what seemed a degree of relief disproportionate to the encounter. They walked together a little way, and Agnes mentioned, in the manner of someone who has been thinking about a thing and finds it suddenly convenient to say it aloud, that she had seen Laura Pritchard that morning, and that Laura had seemed, to use Agnes's precise word, unsettled. "She has a good deal on her mind, I should think," said Miss Marple, in the comfortable, the non-committal tone she had long perfected for drawing out observations without appearing to solicit them. "She has taken it quite hard," Agnes agreed. "Margaret's going." They were not especially close, but Laura has a feeling for continuity. For things remaining as they are, the club matters enormously to her. The records, the minutes. She paused, and then, with the slight hesitation of someone who is not entirely certain a thing ought to be said, added, "She mentioned that she had been going through the attendance book. To bring it up to date, I imagine. She seemed rather preoccupied by it." Miss Marple expressed this to be very natural, and said nothing further on the subject, and they parted at the end of the high street with mutual goodwill. But she turned the small observation over for the remainder of the afternoon, and by Saturday morning had decided that a call upon Laura Pritchard was not only agreeable in itself, but, on the whole, sensible. Laura lived in a narrow terraced house set back slightly from Glebe Road, its front garden given over to lavender and a very determined climbing rose that had long since exceeded whatever boundaries had originally been intended for it. The house had the careful, composed appearance of someone who pays close attention to small things. The letterbox polished, the doorstep swept, the curtains hanging at precisely the same height on either side of the window. Laura answered the door with a dishcloth in one hand and the expression of someone interrupted in a task they had been performing as a means of not thinking about something else. She was, as Agnes had suggested, not entirely herself. Her usual manner, precise, a little formal, always slightly braced against some anticipated administrative oversight, had loosened at the edges in a way that was not immediately obvious, but which Miss Marple noticed at once. They settled in the small sitting room, which smelled pleasantly of beeswax and just perceptibly of old paper, and Laura brought tea with the mechanical competence of someone for whom hospitality is habitual enough to require no concentration. The attendance notebook sat on the writing desk in the corner. Miss Marple did not look at it directly, which was, in part, why she noticed it. They spoke first of Margaret and of the service, and of the rather fine weather that had settled over the village in the past few days. Then, with the ease of a woman who has long known how to approach the centre of a thing by travelling pleasantly around its circumference, Miss Marple remarked upon the great value of careful record-keeping, and said that she had always thought the club's minutes were a model of their kind. Laura received this with a small flush of genuine pleasure, followed almost immediately by something that was not quite discomfort, but was close enough to its neighbourhood to be worth observing. "I have been looking through them," she said, after a brief pause. "The attendance records, particularly." Margaret had borrowed one of the older volumes and the archive book covering the earliest years of the club, just a few weeks before she died. "I've been noting it down properly." "A natural thing to do," said Miss Marple. "I imagine the earlier records are rather interesting. The club has been going for some time." "Nearly 25 years, said Laura. She turned her teacup in its saucer, a small repeated movement that had the quality of something done without awareness. "Some of the earlier entries are in my predecessor's hand, of course, and mine from the first few years. Well, one's style changes. The handwriting of one's 30s and one's present hand are not always entirely consistent." She said this with a slight excess of casualness, in the manner of someone who has prepared a reasonable explanation, and is deploying it in advance of any question. "Handwriting does evolve," Miss Marple agreed pleasantly, "though I have always found that one's hand under pressure, when one is in a hurry or perhaps rather agitated, tends to revert to something rather earlier, as though the pen remembers what the person would prefer to forget." There was a short silence. Laura set down her teacup with a small, careful click. "You're very observant," she said, which was not precisely a response to what had been said, but served well enough as one. "I am old," said Miss Marple with a mild smile, which amounts to much the same thing. She did not press further. She had said enough, and she had observed enough, and it would not have been kind, nor indeed useful, to push Laura Pritchard into a corner before the shape of the room was fully understood. There was something the secretary knew, or suspected, or had seen recorded in the pages of the old archive volume that Margaret had borrowed and returned. Something that had agitated the careful, reliable hand responsible for these margins. What Laura had written there, and whether she had written it before or after Margaret died was a question worth considering. What she had altered, if anything had been altered, was another. Miss Marple finished her tea, admired the climbing rose through the sitting-room window, and took her leave with every appearance of having spent a perfectly agreeable hour in pleasant company. Walking home along Glebe Road, she reflected that a notebook which makes a person uneasy is a notebook that has something to say. The difficulty, as always, was in persuading it to speak. Chapter 5. Old Minutes from the Reading Circle. There are villages in England where nothing of consequence has ever happened, and which are perfectly content with this arrangement. Ashmere Green was not, on the whole, one of these. It had its histories, not dramatic ones for the most part, not the sort that find their way into newspapers or regional chronicles, but the quieter kind. The histories that accumulate in the memories of long-resident families, and the minutes of parish committees, and the particular silences that fall when certain names are mentioned in certain company. Miss Marple had lived in Ashmere Green long enough to know most of these histories, at least in outline. She knew which families had old grievances against which other families, and which of those grievances were still tended, and which had been allowed, through the natural attrition of time and changed circumstance, to go quietly to seed. She knew which houses had changed hands under unhappy conditions, which marriages had been more complicated than they appeared from the outside, which reputations had been carefully constructed, and which had simply grown, like the climbing rose on Laura Pritchard's front wall, by the unplanned accumulation of years. What she had not known, or had not thought to connect, was the matter of Daniel Croft, or it came to her through a combination of recollection and a Wednesday afternoon visit to Mrs. Fellows, who was 91 years old, entirely deaf in one ear, and in possession of a memory for the affairs of Ashmere Green so comprehensive and so precisely retained that Miss Marple had long considered her a resource of the first order, to be consulted with the same respectful attention one might bring to a particularly well-organised archive. Mrs. Fellows lived with her niece in a cottage on the Barton Road, surrounded by an accumulation of decades that included 3 cats of varying antiquity, a great many framed photographs, and a collection of local society programmes going back to the early years of the century. She received Miss Marple in the parlour with the unhurried pleasure of someone for whom visitors represent one of the more reliable entertainments remaining to her, and they drank tea together in the comfortable manner of 2 women who have long since dispensed with any need for social preamble. "I have been thinking," said Miss Marple in due course, "about the early days of the book club, before my time even. You will remember, I imagine, some of the founding members." Mrs. Fellows did remember. She remembered them with the particular clarity that the very old sometimes bring to distant events, as though the intervening decades had polished rather than obscured the original detail. She spoke of the club's first years with warmth and a certain dry amusement, for the early membership had included several individuals whose literary opinions had been considerably more robust than their manners. "There was a Mr. Croft," said Miss Marple, when a suitable pause presented itself. "Daniel Croft. I believe he was a member for a time." Mrs. Fellows set down her cup and looked at Miss Marple with the steady, appraising attention of someone who is deciding how much a question deserves in the way of a full answer. "He was," she said, "for several years, a clever man, rather too aware of it, but that is not an uncommon difficulty." She paused. "He died. You will have heard that?" "I had heard something of it," said Miss Marple. "An accident, I believe." "It was called an accident," said Mrs. Fellows, with the precise and deliberate emphasis of a woman who chooses her words as carefully as she once chose her hats, which was, by all available evidence, with considerable care. "He fell from a ladder at the literary fair. They had been putting up decorations in the assembly rooms. The club had volunteered to assist, which was the sort of thing the club did in those days, before it became rather more exclusively concerned with the reading. He was found at the foot of the ladder the following morning." "The following morning," Miss Marple repeated, not as a question. "He had stayed to finish the work after the others had gone. That, at any rate, was the understanding." Mrs. Fellows smoothed the arm of her chair with one hand. a small gesture, barely perceptible, but indicating that the topic required a certain management. The ladder was examined. It was old. The conclusion was that it had simply given way. "And the alternative conclusion?" said Miss Marple, with perfect mildness. Mrs. Fellows looked at her for a moment with something that was not quite a smile. "You're very direct," she said, "for someone who gives every appearance of only being interested in the biscuits." "I find that directness, at my age, saves a good deal of time," said Miss Marple, "which is increasingly a consideration." Mrs. Fellows acknowledged this with a small nod. "There were those at the time," she said carefully, "who felt that the matter had not been examined with the thoroughness it perhaps deserved. Daniel Croft had made enemies, not numerous ones, but particular ones. He had a quality that certain people find intolerable. He was genuinely and conspicuously more talented than those around him, and he did not always have the tact to disguise it." "That can indeed provoke very strong feelings," said Miss Marple, in the tone of someone remarking upon a well-established principle of human nature. "He had won a literary prize the previous spring, a county competition, nothing of enormous significance, but it mattered to those who had entered it. There was a man who had expected to win, had perhaps felt rather certain of it." She paused again. "I will not say more than that. It was all a long time ago, and the inquest returned its verdict, and Ashmere Green continued as villages do." "Of course," said Miss Marple. She walked home by the longer route, along the footpath that follows the old field boundary behind the church, where the hedgerow was beginning to come into its late spring fullness, and the air had that particular quality of warm stillness that belongs entirely to the English countryside in early June, and nowhere else on earth. She thought about what Mrs. Fellows had told her, and about what she had not told her, and about the archive volume that Margaret Blythe had borrowed from the club records some weeks before her death. The archive volume covered the earliest years of the club, Daniel Croft's membership, his death, the meetings that had occurred in the months surrounding it, with their minutes recorded by whoever had been secretary at the time, listing in careful columns the names of those present at each gathering. Those present on the evening the assembly rooms were decorated would have been listed. The names of those who had stayed late, if such a detail had been noted. The names of those who had not. Margaret had read the archive. Margaret had arrived at the last book club meeting with something on her mind, and had delivered her small, calibrated remark about someone who had escaped justice with the manner of a woman who has recently confirmed a long-held suspicion. She had chosen, that same evening, to read aloud a passage concerning the deliberate withdrawal of care, and then she had died of a heart condition that her doctor had been expecting for some time. Miss Marple paused at the stile that crossed from the footpath into the lane behind the church, and rested her hands on the worn wood for a moment, looking across the field at the rooftops of the village and the square tower of St. Bridget's rising above the limes. It was all as Mrs. Fellows had said a very long time ago. A ladder, old and unreliable, at the end of an evening. A man found the following morning a prize that had gone to someone other than the person who had most wanted it. She thought of Leonard Harwood, he settling into his slightly separate chair, with the composed authority of a man who has spent a great many years being exactly what he appeared to be. She thought of Eleanor Finch, who had been among the founding members, and who had known Daniel Croft and had been present. The archive would confirm on the evening in question. She thought of the quiet solidarity that forms between people who have shared a secret for 25 years, uttered not by any spoken agreement, but by the unspoken understanding that what is never said need never be answered for. Margaret had disturbed that understanding. She had borrowed the archive and read it with fresh eyes and arrived at her conclusions, and she had made the error, entirely characteristic of her, Miss Marple reflected with a small private sorrow, of assuming that the people involved would prefer acknowledgement to continued silence. She had not, it seemed, anticipated the visit that had followed. Miss Marple crossed the stile with the careful deliberateness of someone who is in no hurry, and knows the importance of a firm foothold, and walked the remaining distance to Church Lane in the warm evening air, arranging what she knew into the early provisional order that precedes understanding. The picture was still incomplete, but its subject was becoming, with each passing day, somewhat more legible. Chapter 6. A subscription paid in cash. There is a category of evidence that Miss Marple had always found particularly instructive, and it was not the dramatic kind. Not the blood-stained glove or the overheard confession, or the damning letter discovered at the 11th hour in circumstances of considerable inconvenience to everyone involved. These had their place, she supposed, in the architecture of certain kinds of investigations, the kind one read about in novels, for instance, or encountered in the more sensational variety of newspaper report. But in her own experience, which had been gathered not in police stations or courtrooms, but in sitting rooms and garden paths, and the quiet back rooms of village institutions, it was the financial detail that spoke most plainly. Money, in her observation, had a remarkable tendency to tell the truth. People lied about their feelings, their whereabouts, their opinions of one another, and the precise sequence of events on evenings they would have preferred not to discuss. But money left records. It passed through hands and lodged in ledgers, and surfaced in receipts and subscription lists with a fidelity to fact that human memory, selective by nature and convenience, could seldom match. It was with this principle in mind that she had, over the course of the previous few days, made a series of quiet inquiries regarding the financial arrangements of the book club in its earlier years, specifically the period immediately following Daniel Croft's death. The instrument of her inquiry was, on this occasion, Mr. Gerald Pumphrey of the Lending Library, who had been a young man at the time in question, and who possessed, beneath the mild and slightly distracted manner of a lifetime spent among catalogue cards and overdue notices, a memory for the administrative history of Ashmere Green's various societies and institutions that was very nearly as reliable as Mrs. Fellows's, if considerably less dramatic in its delivery. Mr. Pumphrey had served, in his earlier years, as treasurer of 3 separate village organisations, a role he had occupied with the conscientious thoroughness of someone who finds genuine satisfaction in a column of figures that balances precisely. He had not been treasurer of the book club, but he had known the man who was a retired schoolmaster named Aubrey Clement since deceased, who had kept his accounts in a series of maroon-covered ledgers that had eventually found their way, via the deceased's niece, and a donation made in the spirit of historical preservation, to the shelves of the Lending Library's small local archive. Miss Marple had not known this until Mr. Pumphrey mentioned it, yet in the course of a conversation ostensibly about the library's acquisition of a new reference volume, with the cheerful inconsequentiality of someone who does not realise he has said anything of particular significance. She had asked, very pleasantly, whether the archive might be examined. Mr. Pumphrey had seen no reason why not, and had produced the ledgers from a shelf behind the issue desk, with the air of a man performing a small but agreeable service. The maroon ledgers were 4 in number and covered between them the first 12 years of the book club's financial existence. They were written in the small, extremely regular hand of a man who had spent 4 decades writing on blackboards for the benefit of pupils at the back of a room, and they recorded with admirable precision every subscription received, every expenditure incurred, and every transaction of any description that had passed through the club's modest accounts. Miss Marple had brought her reading glasses and a notepad, and she settled at the small table in the archive corner with the composed attention of someone embarking on a task that is likely to require both patience and concentration. The ledgers were, for the most part, exactly what they appeared to be, the unremarkable financial record of a small literary society going about its quiet business. Subscriptions received annually from each member, duly listed, expenses for the occasional visiting speaker, the purchase of a replacement teapot in the club's 3rd year, noted with a solemnity suggesting that the event had been regarded as of some moment. She found what she was looking for in the 4th ledger, in the entries covering the year of Daniel Croft's death, and the 18 months that followed it. Croft had been, the record showed, a subscribed member in good standing at the time of his death. His annual subscription, a modest sum, but properly rendered, had been paid in the spring preceding the literary fair, and was noted in Aubrey Clement's careful hand alongside those of the other members. What was also noted, in an entry some 4 months after the fair, was a small but distinct financial adjustment. A sum described only as settlement of outstanding account had been received and recorded. This sum corresponded closely to the amount of a debt that appeared in an earlier entry, and as owed to the club's general fund, a loan it seemed that had been extended to one of the members at some point during the preceding year. The name against the loan was Leonard Harwood. The name against the settlement was recorded simply as cash receipt, anonymous donation. Miss Marple sat with this for some time. It was not in itself conclusive of anything. Anonymous donations to small village societies were not unheard of. The timing might have been coincidental. The connection between the debt's erasure and Croft's death might have been nothing more than the natural consequence of a changed circumstance, a legacy received, a financial improvement, a quiet act of generosity by someone who preferred not to be thanked. But anonymous cash, paid promptly, settling a named debt at precisely the moment when the person most likely to have known about the debt and to have pressed for its repayment was no longer present to do so. This was the sort of detail that accumulated alongside other details and began in aggregate to suggest a direction. She noted it carefully on her pad, in her own small handwriting, which bore no resemblance whatsoever to the even columns of the late Aubrey Clement. She returned the ledgers to Mr. Pomfrey with genuine thanks and walked out into the High Street, where the afternoon had settled into the long golden hour that precedes the early summer evening, and where Mrs. Atwell was standing outside the greengrocer's in conversation with Mr. Battersby from the ironmonger's next door, both of them apparently engaged in a detailed examination of the sky. Miss Marple paused to exchange a word with them about the weather, which was very fine, and about the proposed alterations to the parish hall car park, which were not universally welcomed, and then continued on her way with the unhurried step of someone who has learned something useful and is now engaged in the pleasant task of considering what to do with it. The picture that was forming in her mind was not a comfortable one. It was the picture of a man who had allowed envy, a perfectly ordinary human failing, she was careful to remind herself, and one that has brought low a great many people of otherwise reasonable character, to act upon a situation that circumstance had arranged rather too conveniently for his purposes. A ladder, old and imperfectly maintained. An evening when the others had gone home. A debt that had pressed upon him and which the removal of its principal creditor had conveniently resolved. And then 25 years of careful, composed village life. Of book clubs and parish committees and the quiet accumulation of a reputation for steady, reliable respectability. Of a name that no one had reason to question. Until Margaret Blythe had borrowed an archive volume and read it with the attentiveness that she had always brought to texts she considered worth her time, Miss Marple wondered, not for the first time, exactly what Margaret had found. The ledger entries she had examined today were suggestive rather than explicit, and Aubrey Clement had not been a man inclined to editorialize. His entries were precise and impersonal, recording what had occurred without commentary on what it might mean. But the archive volume Margaret had borrowed was the attendance record, not the accounts. The financial ledgers were separate, held here rather than among the club's own papers. Margaret had not then seen what she had just seen. What she had found in the attendance record was something else. A pattern of presence and absence, perhaps. A name recorded as having been there, or not having been there, on a particular evening. A discrepancy between what had been said afterward and what the pages quietly confirmed. This narrowed the question considerably. Miss Marple turned into Church Lane and walked the last few yards to her own gate in the long evening light, nodding to Bert, who was attending to the sweet peas with the expression of a man conducting a satisfactory interview, and reflecting that the archive volume Margaret had borrowed had not, as yet, been returned to the club records from which it came, which meant that it was still somewhere, in Margaret's cottage, perhaps, if it had not been cleared, or returned by another hand to another place entirely. Either possibility was worth pursuing. She went inside, and put on the kettle with the purposeful air of someone settling in to think, and sat down with her notepad in the last of the daylight. Chapter 7. The Rivalry over the Prize Essay. There is a particular quality of ambition that Miss Marple had observed many times over the course of a long life spent among ordinary people, in ordinary places, and which she had come to regard as among the more underestimated forces in human affairs. It was not the large, declarative ambition of those who announce their intentions and pursue them openly, inviting admiration or opposition as the case may be. That variety was in its way, yet almost straightforward, legible at least, even when inconvenient. The variety she had in mind was quieter, and consequently more difficult to account for when it went wrong. It was the ambition of people who had not chosen, or perhaps not been able, to inhabit the larger stage they felt their abilities warranted, and who had therefore transferred that feeling, still perfectly intact, still pressing, onto whatever smaller theatre circumstances had provided. The county prize, the committee chairmanship, the acknowledged precedence in a village literary circle. These things mattered to such people, with an intensity that those without the same disposition frequently failed to understand, and occasionally made the error of dismissing. Miss Marple had never made this error. The history of the County Literary Prize was not a subject she had previously had occasion to investigate, but it proved, upon inquiry, to be more accessible than she had anticipated. The prize had been administered in its earlier years by the County Council's Arts Subcommittee, and the records of its decisions, winners, judges, occasionally the titles of the submitted works, had been published annually in the County Gazette, copies of which were held in various states of completeness by the lending library and by one or two of the older village families who had retained their subscriptions long after the publication had ceased. Mr. Pomfrey had, as she had hoped, a nearly complete run. She did not visit the library again. 2 visits in close succession might attract the gentle curiosity that Mr. Pomfrey, despite his general air of abstraction, was perfectly capable of exercising, but mentioned the County Gazette to Dorothy Spenlow in the course of a Saturday morning conversation, and Dorothy, who had retained her family's copies as a matter of unexamined habit, and who was constitutionally incapable of denying anyone access to anything she possessed, had invited her to come and look through them that very afternoon. Dorothy's back parlour, which served as a repository for the accumulated paper of 3 generations of Spenlows, yielded the relevant volume after a search of perhaps 20 minutes, conducted by Dorothy with the energetic imprecision of someone who knows roughly where everything is and exactly where nothing is. The issue for the year in question was found at last beneath a stack of parish magazines and a copy of a seed catalogue from 1947. The prize entry for the relevant year occupied half a column on the Gazette's inside page, beneath a notice about road maintenance and above an advertisement for a firm of solicitors. It was brief and factual in the manner of provincial journalism. The prize had been awarded to one Daniel Croft of Ashmere Green for an essay entitled The Moral Architecture of the English Village Story, which the judging panel had commended for its originality of argument and clarity of expression. Honourable mention had been accorded to 2 other entries, whose authors were named. Leonard Harwood was among them. Miss Marple read the entry twice, with the same quiet attention she had brought to the lending library's ledgers, and then closed the Gazette and sat for a moment in Dorothy's back parlour, listening to Dorothy moving about in the kitchen beyond and to the pleasant, unhurried sounds of a Saturday afternoon settling around the house. Honourable mention. The phrase had its own particular texture when applied to a man of Leonard Harwood's temperament, a temperament she had been observing with increasing attention over the past several weeks. It was the texture of something offered as a consolation and received as an injury. She'd known, or suspected, the outline of this part of the story since her conversation with Mrs. Fellows. The prize, the rivalry, the death that followed. But knowing an outline and filling it with particularity are different operations, and the particularity mattered. It was the difference between a shadow and the object that casts it. Croft's essay had beaten Harwood's on the judgment of a county panel. This was not a significant prize in any worldly sense. It carried, she recalled from Mrs. Fellow's account, a modest honorarium and the more modest distinction of a listing in the Council's annual arts report. But significance, as she had so often reflected, is not an intrinsic property of events. It is assigned by the people to whom those events occur, according to the particular geography of their desires. To a man who had positioned himself, quietly and persistently, as the foremost literary intelligence of Ashmere Green, who chaired the book club and directed its discussions and occupied his slightly separate chair with the authority of someone whose judgment is not expected to require endorsement, a public defeat at the hands of a fellow member, a man in the same village sitting in the same room each month, would have had a very specific weight, not grief, not despair, something sharper and more focused than either. She thanked Dorothy warmly and declined a second cup of tea on the grounds of a commitment she did not elaborate, and walked home by way of the lane that passed the old assembly rooms, which were now used principally for the monthly farmers' market and an irregular series of events organised by the Horticultural Society. The building was a modest one, late Victorian, red brick, with a shallow portico that had never been quite adequate for its purpose, and a small yard to one side. Miss Marple paused at the gate and looked at the yard without any particular appearance of doing so. It was here or hereabouts that the ladder had stood, here that the decorations for the literary fair had been in preparation, here that Daniel Croft had remained, after the others had gone home, to finish what was begun. A ladder, an old one by all accounts, old enough that its failure would occasion no particular surprise, old enough that someone who had examined it beforehand, who had, perhaps, examined it with more than ordinary attention, might have known precisely what it would bear and what it would not. She had no evidence of this. She wished to be quite clear with herself on that point, as she always was when her reasoning moved into territory that was necessarily speculative. She had a prize record and a debt entry and a dead man and a gap of 25 years, and she had the more recent matter of Margaret Blythe and a conversation that had distressed a weak heart. These things constituted a shape. They did not yet constitute a proof, but she had found, in a long experience of human behaviour, that shapes of this particular kind, assembled from independently gathered details that had not been arranged with any collaborative intention, were seldom misleading in their fundamental outline, even when the precise details required later revision. She arrived home to find a note pushed through her letterbox, near written on the small cream cards that Eleanor Finch used for correspondence, and that always smelled faintly of the dried lavender she kept in her writing desk drawer. The note invited Miss Marple to join a small gathering at Finch House on Monday evening. Nothing formal, Eleanor wrote, merely a few of the club members for supper and conversation, as the next scheduled meeting was still a fortnight away, and the interval had seemed rather long. Dorothy and Agnes were invited, and Leonard. Miss Marple read the note twice, folded it along its original crease, and set it on the mantelpiece. It was, in itself, an entirely ordinary social invitation of the kind that Eleanor Finch had been issuing for years, and which Miss Marple had accepted on many previous occasions with genuine pleasure. Eleanor was an excellent hostess. The food was always well prepared, the conversation directed with a light hand, the fire well maintained and the room warm. There was no reason to read anything into it. And yet Miss Marple found herself reflecting that Eleanor had been present at the literary fair. Eleanor had known Daniel Croft. Eleanor had sat at those early meetings and recorded, or watched recorded, the names of those who had been present and those who had not. And Eleanor had, for 25 years, continued to open her sitting room each month to a man who sat slightly apart from the arc of chairs, with his particular brand of composed authority, as though the room and all it contained had been arranged for his benefit. She thought of the note in Eleanor's careful hand, and of the attendance archive that had not yet been accounted for, and of the way Eleanor had reached in the same moment that she moved to take away the empty teacup, to put it back at Miss Marple's quiet request, as though she too was waiting for something to be said. Miss Marple took out her pen and wrote a brief acceptance, addressed it in her own hand, and set it on the hall table to be delivered in the morning. There were, she reflected, conversations that could only occur in person. Monday evening would do very well. Chapter 8. A conversation beside the herb border. Monday evening arrived in the gentle, unhurried way of early June evenings in the English countryside, the light lasting well past supper, and lending the village the slightly unreal quality of a place that has been carefully arranged for someone's appreciation. The gardens along Church Lane were at their best, and Miss Marple walked to Finch House by the longer route, as she often did when she wished to think, passing the churchyard wall where the old roses had come into full flower, and the air held the particular sweetness that belongs to that precise week, and no other. She arrived to find Dorothy and Agnes already present in Eleanor's sitting room, and Leonard Harwood standing near the window with a glass of sherry, looking out at the garden with the satisfied expression of a man who has arranged his evening to his own specification. Dorothy was in animated conversation with Agnes about a proposed alteration to the Horticultural Society's summer schedule. Agnes was listening with her customary quiet attention and contributing at intervals. The room had the comfortable warmth of an established social occasion, the kind that requires no particular effort from anyone present, because its forms have been agreed upon by long custom. Eleanor was not in the sitting room. "She's in the garden," Leonard said, and turning from the window with the easy authority of someone who has appointed himself keeper of small domestic facts. "She will be in directly." Miss Marple accepted a glass of sherry from the sideboard, exchanged a pleasant word with Dorothy about the roses, and excused herself in the direction of the garden door with the air of someone in search of a little air before supper. The garden at Finch House was long and narrow, with a terrace of grey stone flags immediately beyond the door, and then a lawn that descended in a shallow gradient toward a kitchen garden, and, at its far boundary, a herb border that ran the full width of the plot beneath a low brick wall. Eleanor was there, crouching slightly beside the border with a pair of small scissors, cutting something with the focused attention of a woman engaged in a task she finds genuinely absorbing. She looked up at the sound of Miss Marple's step on the path, and something passed briefly across her face. Not alarm, precisely, but a small recalibration. The expression of someone who has been alone with their thoughts, and is now required to present themselves in company. "I needed some time for tomorrow," she said, rising with the careful movement of someone whose knees have ceased to be entirely obliging. "And I find the garden useful for thinking." "I have always found that to be true," said Miss Marple. "There is something about attending to growing things that clears the mind." They stood together for a moment in the long evening light, looking at the herb border, which was flourishing with the vigour of a garden that is both well planned and well tended. Thyme and rosemary and a broad clump of sage, and at the far end a lavender that had spread considerably beyond its original station, and appeared entirely unrepentant about having done so. "I've been thinking about Margaret," said Miss Marple presently. She said it in the mild, reflective tone she used when introducing a subject that she intended to pursue, without appearing to pursue it. About what she said at the last meeting, and about the days that followed. Eleanor did not reply immediately. She turned the small bunch of thyme in her fingers, straightening the stems with quiet care. "I think about it also," she said at last. She had borrowed the attendance archive," said Miss Marple. "The early volume. I imagine she had been reading it rather carefully." "Yes." The word came without hesitation, which was itself informative. Eleanor had known about the borrowing, had perhaps known what Margaret had found. "She came to me," Eleanor continued after a pause that had the quality of a decision being reached. "Before the meeting, she told me what she believed. About Mr. Croft. About the evening of the fair." Eleanor's voice was steady, but there was a tiredness in it. Not the tiredness of age, but the deeper variety that comes from carrying a thing for a very long time. She had found the record of attendance. The evening had run late. Most of us had gone home by 9:30. The minutes noted it. The secretary in those days was quite thorough about departure times, and which struck us as rather eccentric at the time, but which Margaret had apparently found very instructive. And the record showed who had remained. It showed that Leonard had stayed. That was not in itself unusual. He had a particular interest in the fair, had organised much of it. But it also showed— She paused, turning the time once more. It showed that he had been the last to speak with Daniel before the others left. There was a note in the margin, a small thing, the sort of annotation that seems trivial at the time and is made without any thought for its future significance. She looked up briefly toward the house, where the warm light of the sitting room windows made the evening seem darker by comparison. The margin note read, LH and DC remained to finish hanging. All others departed 9:30. And Daniel Croft was found the following morning, said Miss Marple, at 7 o'clock. By the caretaker. Eleanor set the time down on the low wall beside her. I have known this for 25 years. I did not know it, certainly, not in the way one knows a fact one has witnessed, but I knew it in the way one sometimes knows things that one would very much prefer not to, as a persistent discomfort that does not resolve itself and cannot quite be argued away. Miss Marple was quiet for a moment. The garden held the evening warmly, and from somewhere beyond the wall came the unhurried sound of a blackbird completing its day. Margaret came to tell you, she said gently, and then she confronted Leonard. Eleanor's silence was its own confirmation. She did not intend harm, Eleanor said at last. That is what I find most. That is what has stayed with me. Margaret was not a vindictive person. She did not go to Leonard with the intention of destroying him. She went because she felt that acknowledgement was owed. To Daniel's memory, I suppose. To the truth of what had happened. She paused. She had this quality, you will remember it, of believing that the honest course is always, in the end, the kinder one, even when it is not. I remember it very well, said Miss Marple. She told me that she had said to him that she did not intend to go to anyone in authority, that she was too old and the matter too distant for that kind of pursuit. She wanted only for him to acknowledge it, to herself, and to Eleanor. She stopped and corrected herself with a small, tired gesture. To me. She thought, I believe, that this would be sufficient, that a man who had carried such a thing for 25 years might even feel some relief. And instead, said Miss Marple quietly, he felt fear. Eleanor looked at her with the clear, unhappy gaze of someone hearing a thing confirmed that they have spent considerable time hoping might remain unconfirmed. He came to her that evening, Eleanor said. The evening after the meeting. I did not know this until afterward, until she had gone, and I was thinking back through those final days. He came to persuade her to remain silent. I do not know what was said between them. I know only that Margaret telephoned me the following morning and told me she was unwell, and that she sounded not herself. She sounded frightened. And 2 days later she was dead, said Miss Marple. The word sat between them in the mild evening air without drama or embellishment, carrying only its own quiet weight. Her heart was not strong, Eleanor said. Everyone knew that. The doctor had said for 2 years that she must avoid agitation. She looked down at the herb border, at the orderly, fragrant rows of growing things. I have asked myself many times whether what happened was, whether it constitutes a thing that ought to be answered for. I have not found a satisfactory answer. I wonder, said Miss Marple, whether Leonard has found one either. From the house came Dorothy's voice, calling pleasantly that supper was very nearly ready, and that they should come in before the soup cooled. Eleanor picked up her time from the wall, and the two women walked back up the garden path together in the last of the evening light, slowly and without hurrying, each occupied with her own thoughts, which were not entirely dissimilar. Chapter 9. What was meant as fiction. There is a moment in the resolution of any mystery. Miss Marple had observed this many times, though she had never found occasion to discuss it with anyone who would not have found the observation either alarming or eccentric, when the investigator must make a choice that has nothing whatever to do with evidence. The evidence by that stage has generally said what it is going to say. The facts have arranged themselves into their proper order, and the picture they compose is sufficiently legible that further examination yields only confirmation of what is already understood. What remains is a question of a different character entirely, not what happened, but what is to be done about it. This was the question Miss Marple carried with her through the 3 days following supper at Finch House, I'm turning it over in the manner she reserved for questions that required not analysis but judgment. She went about her ordinary affairs. She attended to the sweet peas with Bert, who reported that the climbing varieties were coming on nicely, and that the slugs had been less troublesome than anticipated, which was the closest Bert generally came to optimism. She called upon Mrs. Trent and found her in fine spirits. She read, in the evenings, without retaining very much of what she read, which was an indication that the foreground of her attention was fully occupied elsewhere. By Thursday morning she had reached her conclusion, and having reached it, she wrote a brief note to Leonard Harwood requesting the pleasure of a short conversation at his convenience, and sent it by hand with the boy from next door, who performed such errands for a consideration that Miss Marple regarded as modest, and he regarded as entirely satisfactory. Leonard Harwood's reply came by mid-afternoon. He would be pleased to receive her on Friday at 11 at his house on the Westerham Road. The house was a solid Edwardian villa set back from the road behind a privet hedge maintained with the kind of rigid precision that suggests a proprietorial relationship with order. Leonard answered the door himself. He lived alone. Kitty, attended by a housekeeper who came each morning and departed before lunch, and received Miss Marple with the composed civility of a man who's been expecting a visit and has spent the intervening time preparing for it. He showed her into the study, which was the room of a man who wishes to be understood as serious. Books arranged by subject and then by height, a large desk with nothing unnecessary upon it, framed certificates of membership in various county bodies arranged along one wall. A room that announced, quietly but with considerable persistence, that its occupant was a person of standing and accomplishment. Miss Marple sat in the offered chair and accepted the offer of tea, which gave them both a few minutes of the conventional formality that such situations require before they can proceed to their actual purpose. "You have been inquiring," Leonard said, when the tea had been poured and the housekeeper had withdrawn. He said it without particular inflection, not accusatory, not defensive, but with the flat acknowledgement of a man who has made it his business to know what occurs in Ashmere Green, and who has been observing, with increasing attention, the quiet trajectory of her activities over the past several weeks. "I have been thinking," Miss Marple replied pleasantly, which in my case tends to involve a certain amount of conversation. "Yes." He looked at her with the careful attention he had always brought to things he considered worth examining. "Eleanor spoke to you." "Eleanor has been carrying a great deal for a very long time," said Miss Marple. "It was rather a relief to her, I think, to say some of it aloud." Leonard was quiet for a moment. He held his teacup with the stillness of a man who has learned, somewhere in a long life of public composure, to keep his hands from betraying him. "What is it that you wish to say to me?" he asked at last. "Very little, in fact," said Miss Marple. "I am more interested in what you might wish to say. It has been my observation that people who have carried a thing for 25 years are frequently rather more ready to speak of it than they anticipate. The carrying becomes fatiguing." Something shifted in his expression. It was not dramatic. Leonard Harwood was not a man given to dramatic expression, but it was perceptible to anyone paying the right kind of attention, which Miss Marple invariably was. It was the expression of someone who has maintained a structure with considerable effort for a very long time, and has just felt for the first time its foundation shift slightly beneath him. Margaret's remark at the meeting, Miss Marple continued in the same gentle conversational tone, Lasse was not made at random. She had read the attendance archive. She had understood what the margin note recorded. She knew who had remained with Daniel Croft on the evening of the fair, and she had drawn the conclusion that the evidence supported. A conclusion, Leonard said carefully, that she had no means of proving. "No," said Miss Marple. She was quite clear on that point when she spoke to Eleanor. She was not seeking legal remedy. She was too old, as she said, and the matter too distant for that kind of pursuit. She wanted only acknowledgement. It was rather characteristic of her. Leonard set down his cup. He looked at the window for a moment, at the privet hedge beyond it, dense and perfectly squared. "I went to her," he said. The words came without preamble, as though a decision had been reached in some interior room, and the door had been opened without ceremony. The evening after the meeting, I had to know what she intended. Whether she would be satisfied with silence, or whether— He stopped. "You went to persuade her," said Miss Marple. "I went to understand the extent of the problem." He paused, and then, with the candour of a man who has decided that precision is now the only remaining form of dignity available to him, corrected himself. "Yes, to persuade her." The conversation became heated. More heated than I had anticipated or intended. That Margaret was not easily persuaded of things she had determined were right, as you will know. "I knew her for 30 years, said Miss Marple. "I know it very well." "She was not afraid of me," he said, and there was in his voice something that might almost have been respect, or the memory of it. That was what I had not accounted for. I had assumed that a firm expression of the consequences of pursuing the matter would be sufficient. Instead, she told me, quite calmly, that she was 72 years old and in indifferent health, and that there was very little I could threaten her with that nature had not already arranged. He was quiet for a moment. She told me that I had been afraid for 25 years, and that she was sorry for it, but that she was not willing to add another year to the account. She said it kindly. Miss Marple had to look away briefly, to the window and the squared hedge, and the ordinary Friday morning proceeding beyond it. "The argument was prolonged," Leonard continued, "more prolonged than it should have been. I was not my best self. I said things that I do not regard with any satisfaction." He turned his cup in its saucer. "When I left, she was distressed, considerably distressed. I knew that her heart was not strong. I had known it for 2 years, as everyone had." He met Miss Marple's gaze with the direct, undeflecting look of a man making a reckoning. "I told myself, walking home, that she would rest and recover herself and that the matter would resolve. I told myself this quite deliberately, because the alternative was to go back, and I did not go back." The room held the silence for a moment without discomfort. "You did not intend her death," said Miss Marple quietly. "No." The word was immediate and unequivocal. "That is the truth, for whatever it is worth. I did not intend it. But I have thought, every day since, about the fact that intention is not the whole of the matter." He looked at his hands. "Margaret said something to that effect herself during our conversation. She had been reading a novel, apparently, that addressed the question rather directly." "She generally had," said Miss Marple. In the long considered pause that followed, she thought about Daniel Croft and the prize essay, and a ladder in the assembly room yard on a night 25 years ago. She thought about what can be carried, and for how long, and what it costs. She thought about Margaret's voice reading aloud by the fireplace, and the particular deliberateness with which she had read one phrase twice. "What happens now?" Leonard asked. It was not a demand. It had the quality of a genuine inquiry, a man asking a question to which he did not know the answer, and had perhaps ceased to believe he could determine it himself. Miss Marple considered her reply with the care it deserved. "That," she said at last, depends rather on what you consider adequate to the situation. The law cannot help us. The facts as they stand are too old and too unwitnessed for that remedy. What remains is a question of what a person owes to their own conscience, and to the memory of those they have wronged." She paused. "In my experience, people who ask the question you have just asked already know the broad shape of the answer. It is only the particulars that require working out." Leonard Harwood sat with this for a long moment, looking at nothing in particular, in the way of a man who is finally, after a very long time, looking at something quite specific. Miss Marple finished her tea, set the cup down with a small, gentle click, and did not press him further. Some conclusions, she had always found, are best reached in one's own time and in one's own company. Chapter 10. Shelves Set Straight Again. The news that Leonard Harwood had resigned from the book club reached Ashmere Green in the quiet, undramatic way that most news of any genuine significance tends to arrive, not announced, but discovered. The way one discovers a change in the weather not from any single cloud, but from a gradual alteration in the quality of the light. He had written to Eleanor, whose sitting room had housed the club for 12 years, and who was, in practical terms, if not in formal title, its presiding intelligence. The letter was courteous and brief. He cited his health, which had been giving him some concern. He expressed gratitude for many years of stimulating conversation. He wished the club well in its continued endeavours. He did not elaborate, and Eleanor, reading the letter at her writing desk on a Tuesday morning in the second week of June, did not require him to. She told Dorothy, who told Agnes, and between the two of them the information was distributed through the appropriate channels of village communication with the gentle efficiency that such channels, when properly employed, are capable of achieving. The general response was one of mild regret and the comfortable understanding that people of a certain age must be permitted to manage their commitments according to their own assessment of their capacities. Leonard had also, it emerged over the following days, untendered his resignation from the Parish Hall Committee and declined renewal of his membership on the County Arts Advisory Board. He was, it was generally understood, simplifying. He remained in Ashmere Green. He was seen occasionally in the High Street and at the church on Sundays, and once in the greengrocer's examining the summer lettuces with the expression of a man performing an ordinary task with somewhat more than ordinary concentration. He nodded to those he knew, which was everyone, and exchanged brief words with those he encountered, and was received with the unremarkable courtesy that a village extends to its long-established residents as a matter of course. Miss Marple observed this from a comfortable distance, and said nothing to anyone that she had not said already. The book club met on the third Thursday of June in Eleanor's sitting room, as it had always met, even with the floral cushions in their proper places, and the Earl Grey warming beneath its cosy, and the plate of biscuits at the centre of the table. Rather better biscuits than usual, as it happened, because Eleanor had made them herself that morning, which was something she did only when she felt the occasion warranted a small additional effort. The membership had, by general and unspoken agreement, again rearranged itself with the natural adaptability of any established group that has lost members and must redistribute its equilibrium. The slightly separate chair that Leonard had always occupied had been drawn, without ceremony, into the ark by Eleanor during her preparations, and no one remarked upon it. Dorothy had taken a seat closer to the fire than she generally preferred. Agnes had placed her library book on the table at the start of the evening rather than keeping it in her lap, which was for Agnes a gesture of notable informality. Laura Pritchard arrived with the attendance notebook and her library copy, and the expression of a woman who has resolved, after a period of uncharacteristic agitation, to return to the settled practice of her ordinary life. She had not spoken to Miss Marple directly about the matter of the notebook's altered entries, and Miss Marple had not invited her to. There are questions that are better resolved by their own dissolution than by direct address, and the question of what Laura had known or suspected and had felt impelled to adjust had become, in the current circumstances, a matter for Laura's own conscience rather than for external examination. She took her seat, opened the notebook to a fresh page and wrote the date in her neat, reliable hand. Eleanor opened the meeting with a brief acknowledgement of the changes in their number, yet offered in the measured warm language of someone who has thought carefully about how much needs to be said and has arrived at precisely the right amount. She said that they had lost 2 members in recent months, and that both were greatly missed, and that the club was, as it had always been, a place of continuing conversation, which was itself a form of remembrance. She said this simply and without embellishment, and it was received in the spirit in which it was offered. Miss Marple, as sitting beside the window in the long evening light, thought of Margaret's empty chair and the teacup that had been placed there by habit, and of the way Eleanor had moved to take it away and then, at a word, had left it. She thought that Eleanor Finch had been, in her quiet and self-contained way, managing a very great deal for a very long time, and that the management had cost her something, and that the particular straightness of her posture this evening had about it the quality not merely of composure but of relief. The evening's discussion was a lively one. The chosen novel was a comedy of manners set in a country house, and it provided ample material for the exercise of opinion, which Dorothy supplied in considerable quantity, and Agnes qualified with the thoughtful precision that was her particular contribution to the club's collective intelligence. Laura offered a careful observation about the novel's narrative structure that surprised everyone present, including apparently herself, and was received with genuine appreciation. Miss Marple contributed at intervals in her mild and slightly wandering manner, observations that appeared tangential and occasionally were, but which had a tendency to illuminate whatever they touched. She remarked at one point, in connection with the novel's central character, a woman of apparently simple disposition who turns out to have understood everything from the beginning, that there is a form of intelligence that is most effective when it is least announced, and that such people are frequently underestimated by those who consider visibility and acuity to be the same thing. Dorothy said that this was very true, and cited 3 examples from her personal acquaintance, 2 of which were opposite. Agnes said nothing, but caught Miss Marple's eye across the room with the small level look of someone who has understood more than she has said, which was, Miss Marple reflected, rather characteristic. After the meeting, when Dorothy and Agnes had departed together with their usual running commentary and Laura had gathered her notebook and said her careful good nights, Miss Marple remained for a few minutes in the sitting room while Eleanor saw the others to the door. She sat in the comfortable silence of a room that has held a great deal and is now, for the moment, simply itself, the bookshelves orderly in the fading light, the fire settling to its embers, the teacups collected on the tray, with the quiet finality of an evening concluded. Eleanor returned and sat down in her own chair, and for a few minutes they were companionably quiet, in the way of people who have known each other long enough that silence requires no apology. "He will not be entirely comfortable," Eleanor said at last. It was not a question. "No," said Miss Marple, "I don't imagine he will. But comfort is not perhaps what the situation calls for." She paused. "He knows what he has done, and what it cost. He will carry it more honestly now, I think, than he did before. That is not nothing." Eleanor looked at the fire. Daniel Croft deserved better. "He did," said Miss Marple, "and Margaret deserved better. But we're not always in a position to give people what they deserve, and the attempt to do so, when the available instruments are imprecise, can cause considerable additional harm." She smoothed the grey wool of her skirt with one hand. "What we can sometimes do is ensure that those responsible are no longer permitted to occupy positions of authority over the very communities they have wronged. Leonard will no longer chair anything in Ashmere Green. He will no longer sit in his separate chair and direct the conversation. That is a small justice, perhaps. But small justices, in my experience, are the kind most reliably available to us." Eleanor was quiet for a moment, and then said, with the understated warmth that was her native register, "I am glad you came to the meeting that evening, Jane. The one in April." "I always come," said Miss Marple simply. She rose and gathered her cardigan, and Eleanor walked with her to the door, and they stood for a moment on the step in the warm June evening, where the roses along the churchyard wall were still faintly visible in the last of the light, and the village lay around them in its accustomed quiet. People imagine murder requires passion, Miss Marple reflected, walking home along Church Lane in the soft dark. Often it requires only pride, and the fear of losing one's standing. The passionate crime announces itself. It is the proud one that learns to be invisible. That takes a seat among the respectable and the well-regarded and attends, year after year, to all the proper forms. She let herself in through her own gate, noted with approval that Bert had staked the sweet peas very neatly, and went inside to make a last cup of tea in the comfortable quiet of her own kitchen. The book club would meet again next month, and the month after that, and the discussions would continue with the reliable, gentle pleasure of people who find in shared reading a thing worth returning to. The shelves in Eleanor's sitting room would remain orderly. The minutes would be kept in Laura's careful hand. The biscuits would be very nearly always good. Beneath each polite exchange, as beneath every